The Vorthak Medical Research Station hung in the void like a metallic tumor, all gleaming surfaces and sterile corridors that screamed of scientific superiority. Doctor. Crix adjusted his forearms with practiced efficiency, each limb ending in delicate manipulator claws that had opened more specimens than he cared to count. His compound eyes swept across the pristine laboratory, taking in the rows of dissection tables, the humming bioscanners, and the wall-mounted collection of lesser species preserved in containment fluid. Another productive cycle ahead of us, Crix mused to himself, his voice carrying that particular blend of boredom and superiority that came with being the galaxy's foremost expert on primitive biology. The Vorthak had been dissecting inferior life forms for 3 centuries now, and honestly, the novelty had worn thin somewhere around specimen number 4000. The facility's reputation preceded it across 17 star systems. When some backwater military wanted to understand their enemies, when trade guilds needed biological assessments of new worlds, but when anyone needed to know exactly how fragile and predictable a species really was, they sent their specimens to Crix. The good doctor had opened everything from the multi-tentacled Slorians to the crystalline hexites, each one revealing the same disappointing truth: all these so-called intelligent species were remarkably similar in their weakness. Dr. Crix, the morning reports, his assistant Zul announced, gliding into the laboratory on his hoverpad. The younger Vorthak's enthusiasm still hadn't been properly crushed by decades of cutting open the galaxy's most boring creatures. We have 17 specimens scheduled for processing today, including 3 from that Terran conflict zone. Ah, yes, the humans. Crix's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. The newest addition to their catalog of primitive life forms, these bipedal mammals had been making quite the noise lately. Something about expanding their territory, defending their colonies, fighting back against superior civilizations. How quaint, how utterly predictable. Terrans. Crix repeated the word like he was discussing a particularly unimpressive fungus. Bipedal, single-hearted, laughably slow healing rates, and apparently they think they can challenge species that have been traveling the stars since before their ancestors learned to make fire. The intelligence reports suggest they have some sort of military prowess, but really, how dangerous could a species be when they can die from something as simple as blood loss? Zul consulted his datapad, compound eyes reflecting the blue glow of the screen. The preliminary scans show standard mammalian biology, sir. Nothing we haven't seen 1,000 times before. A calcium-based skeletal structure, carbon-based neural networks, and that primitive liquid-based circulatory system. Honestly, it's almost insulting that Command thinks these require our level of expertise. The laboratory's main display flickered to life, showing a rotating schematic of human anatomy that looked like something a first-year medical student might find challenging. Crix studied it with the same expression one might reserve for observing paint dry. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, internal organs arranged in the most predictable configuration imaginable. Where was the innovation? Where was the biological ingenuity that made dissection interesting? Look at this circulatory system. Crix pointed one of his claws at the display. A single 4-chambered pump, pushing liquid through simple tubes. When that stops, they stop. No redundancy, no backup systems, no ability to reroute critical functions. And they call themselves a spacefaring civilization. Security Chief Garn chose that moment to lumber into the laboratory, his massive frame casting shadows across the gleaming equipment. The Vorthak military caste was built for intimidation, but even Garn seemed almost bored by the prospect of containing human specimens. Doctor, the new arrivals are being processed through quarantine. Standard security protocols should be more than adequate. From what I understand, humans require oxygen to survive. Their skin can be punctured by simple metal implements, and they become unconscious when subjected to mild electrical stimulation. Fascinating, Crix replied with all the enthusiasm of someone being told that water was wet. Another species that evolution apparently forgot to optimize. No natural armor, no toxin resistance, no ability to regenerate lost limbs. I suppose we should feel grateful that the universe keeps providing us with such simple puzzles to solve. The three Vortex stood in their sterile domain, surrounded by the tools and technology that had made them the premier biological research facility in known space. They had dissected the cunning, opened the dangerous, and analyzed the mysterious. After all these years, after all these species, they had learned one universal truth: complex life was remarkably fragile and predictably designed. What could possibly go wrong with one more primitive bipedal mammal? The transport shuttle's arrival was announced by a series of mechanical chimes that echoed through the research station's docking bay. Dr. Creeks made his way to the receiving area, his four arms swaying with each step as he mentally prepared for another routine specimen intake. Behind him, Zool floated along on his hoverpad, data tablet clutched in his primary manipulators, but while Security Chief Garn's heavy footsteps created a rhythmic thudding that seemed to shake the very walls. Specimen designation? Crix inquired as the containment unit was wheeled into the laboratory's receiving chamber. Human male, captured during the Kepler station engagement, the transport technician replied, consulting his own device. Military classification suggests some sort of soldier caste. Age approximately 30 standard cycles, mass around 80 kilograms, height 1.8 meters. Garn snorted, a sound that emerged from his breathing slits like escaping steam. 80 kilograms? My ceremonial armor weighs more than that. How exactly did the hegemony forces have trouble with these things? The containment pod hissed open, revealing the unconscious form of what the shipping manifest identified as Marcus Kane, human infantry specialist. Crix leaned forward, compound eyes adjusting focus as he examined their latest delivery. The specimen was secured with standard restraint cables, though honestly, the precautions seemed excessive. The human looked even more fragile than the anatomical projections had suggested. "Look at this skin," Crix commented, extending one claw to poke at the exposed arm. Barely thicker than membrane tissue. You could probably puncture it with a writing stylus. And this muscle density, it's like they are made of some sort of organic padding material. Zool was busy running preliminary scans, the biosensors humming as they gathered data. Heartbeat is remarkably slow, sir. Only 72 beats per minute. Most civilized species maintain at least double that rate. And the blood pressure readings suggest their circulatory system operates at laughably low efficiency. Primitive engineering. Crix agreed, walking around the examination table where they had transferred the human specimen. Notice how the limbs are attached with simple ball and socket joints. No redundant connection points, no emergency disconnection protocols. If you damage one joint, the entire limb becomes useless. Security Chief Garn was examining the human's equipment, which had been catalogued and placed on a nearby table. Standard projectile weapons, chemical explosives, and some sort of communication device. Their technology appears to be several centuries behind current galactic standards. These weapons couldn't penetrate basic personal shielding. The human Marcus Kane lay motionless on the examination table, breathing with the slow, steady rhythm that Crix associated with deep unconsciousness. The sedatives administered during transport should keep the specimen inactive for at least 12 hours, plenty of time for a thorough examination and dissection. The doctor activated the overhead recording devices and began his standard preliminary assessment. The subject appears to be a typical human male in what their species would consider prime physical condition, Crix dictated to the recording system. Muscle development suggests regular physical training, though by galactic standards, the strength indicators are remarkably low. Bone density scans show the expected calcium phosphate structure with no notable reinforcement or adaptive modifications. Zool was preparing the surgical instruments, arranging the molecular cutters, tissue samplers, and organ extractors with practiced efficiency. Dr. Crix, should we follow standard dissection protocol? Start with the extremities and work inward toward the vital organs? Actually, let's begin with the torso, Crix decided, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. I want to examine this primitive cardiovascular system first. According to the data, if we stop that single heart, the entire organism ceases to function. It's almost embarrassingly simple. Garn moved to his monitoring station, where he could observe both the specimen and the laboratory's security feeds. Doctor, the restraint systems show minimal stress. The subject hasn't moved since arrival. These humans really are as fragile as the intelligence reports suggested. The bioscanners continued their work, mapping every organ, every major blood vessel, every neural pathway in the unconscious human. The readings were exactly what Crix had expected: boring, predictable, and disappointingly simple. No hidden organs, no backup systems, no evolutionary surprises. Just another primitive species that had somehow managed to stumble into space travel despite their obvious biological limitations. Respiratory rate is only 16 breaths per minute, Zool observed, checking the atmospheric analyzers. They require constant oxygen intake to maintain consciousness. He cut off their air supply for just a few minutes, and they become completely helpless. Pathetic, Crix muttered, selecting his preferred molecular cutter from the instrument array. 3 centuries of research, and we are still finding species that evolution apparently designed as comedy relief. Well, let's get this over with. The sooner we catalog this one's weaknesses, the sooner we can move on to something more interesting. The surgical lights brightened, casting harsh shadows across the sterile laboratory as Dr. Crix positioned himself over the human specimen. Marcus Kane remained motionless, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, completely unaware that he was about to become another entry in the Vorthak database of inferior species. Outside the laboratory windows, the stars watched in silent anticipation. Dr. Crix activated the molecular cutter with a soft hum that filled the sterile laboratory. The device's energy field glowed a pleasant blue, ready to slice through the primitive human tissue like it was some sort of organic gelatin. He positioned the instrument over Marcus Kane's chest, just above where the preliminary scans had located the heart. Beginning initial incision, Crix announced to the recording system, his voice carrying the same bored professionalism of someone performing their 10,000th routine procedure. Subject remains completely unconscious. Sedation levels appear optimal for extended examination. The molecular cutter descended toward the human skin, but something made Crix pause. A tiny fluctuation in the bioscanner readings, barely noticeable unless you had been doing this for as long as he had. The human's heartbeat had accelerated slightly, jumping from 72 beats per minute to 85. Zool, check the sedation levels, Crix instructed, not particularly concerned. The subject appears to be experiencing some minor physiological response. His assistant consulted the monitoring equipment, compound eyes reflecting the data streams. All readings within normal parameters, Doctor. The increase in cardiac activity is likely just a reflexive response to the temperature change. These mammals are notoriously sensitive to environmental fluctuations. Crix nodded, satisfied with the explanation. Primitive species often displayed such basic reactions even under deep sedation. He resumed his position and made the first cut, a precise line across the human's chest that should have penetrated exactly 3 centimeters into the tissue. The molecular cutter sliced through skin and muscle with expected efficiency, but the bioscanners immediately registered something unusual. The wound began exhibiting accelerated clotting activity, far faster than their projections had indicated. Within seconds, the bleeding had nearly stopped entirely. Interesting, Crix murmured, extending the incision. The coagulation response is more rapid than anticipated. Their healing factors may be slightly more developed than our initial assessment suggested. Zool was monitoring the neural activity sensors, which had begun displaying erratic patterns across their screens. Dr. Crix, I'm seeing unusual brainwave activity. The patterns don't match standard unconscious states for mammalian species. Probably just primitive neural responses to tissue trauma. Crix dismissed the concern with a wave of one claw. These simple nervous systems often generate random electrical activity when subjected to surgical procedures. Nothing we haven't observed in other inferior species. Security Chief Garn shifted position at his monitoring station, his massive frame creating new shadows across the laboratory floor. Doctor, the restraint sensors are showing minor stress variations. The cables are registering slight tension changes. Crix paused in his work, molecular cutter hovering above the human's partially opened chest cavity. The restraint system was designed to contain specimens up to 10 times human strength levels, so minor fluctuations were hardly cause for concern. Still, 3 simultaneous anomalies were beginning to form a pattern that tickled at his scientific curiosity. To run a deep tissue scan, he instructed Zool. Let's see what's happening beneath the surface. The bioscanners intensified their penetration, sending waves of energy through Marcus Kane's unconscious form. The results appeared on the main display, showing a 3-dimensional map of the human's internal systems. Everything appeared normal, except for one small detail that made Crix's mandibles click in confusion. The human's muscle fibers were contracting in microscopic patterns, too small to be visible externally but clearly detectable by their sophisticated equipment. It was almost as if the specimen was trying to move, despite being under enough sedation to keep a Rigelian combat beast unconscious for days. Curious muscle activity, Crix noted, making another incision to examine the tissue more closely. The motor neurons appeared to be firing in sequences that suggest conscious control, but that's obviously impossible given the sedative levels. As he spoke, the human's fingers twitched, barely perceptible movement that caused the restraint cables to shift slightly. The motion was so subtle that only the sensitive equipment detected it, but it sent a small spike through the monitoring systems. Dr. Crix. Zool's voice carried a note of uncertainty that was unusual for the normally confident assistant. The brain scans are showing activity patterns that resemble rapid eye movement sleep states. But the subject's eyes aren't moving, and the neural patterns are far too organized for unconscious brain activity. Crix made a 3rd incision, this one deeper than the previous cuts, exposing more of the human's internal structure. The molecular cutter sliced through tissue that seemed oddly resistant, requiring more energy than their calculations had predicted. Human muscle density was apparently higher than their preliminary assessments had indicated. Remarkable, the doctor commented, though his tone suggested he found it more irritating than fascinating. This specimen seems determined to be slightly different from our projections in every minor detail. Perhaps human biology is marginally more complex than we initially assumed. The temperature sensors throughout the laboratory began registering subtle changes as well. The human's body heat was increasing, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that metabolic activity was higher than expected for a sedated subject. The thermal patterns showed circulation improvements that shouldn't have been occurring in an unconscious organism. Garn's security monitors started displaying mild electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from the examination table. Nothing that suggested immediate danger, but enough to indicate that something within the human specimen was generating low-level energy fields that their sensors couldn't quite categorize. Dr. Garn rumbled from his station, "Perhaps we should increase the sedation levels. These minor anomalies might indicate that the current dosage is insufficient for this particular specimen." Crix considered the suggestion while making his 4th incision, exposing more of the human's chest cavity. The tissue continued to heal faster than expected, and the muscle responses were becoming more pronounced, though still subtle enough that they could be explained away as normal biological functions. No need for additional sedatives, Crix decided, his scientific pride refusing to acknowledge that a primitive human might require special consideration. These are just minor variations within acceptable parameters. Every species has slight differences from the baseline projections. But as he positioned the molecular cutter for his next cut, aiming for the area around the human's heart, Dr. Crix couldn't shake the growing feeling that something about this dissection was different. The readings, the responses, the subtle signs all pointed toward a conclusion that his superior intellect refused to accept. Marcus Kane was waking up. Dr. Crix was positioning his molecular cutter for what he expected to be the final incision when Marcus Kane's eyes snapped open. Not the gradual flutter of awakening that most species exhibited when emerging from sedation, but the immediate, predatory focus of something that had been consciously fighting its way back to awareness. For exactly 1.7 seconds, human and alien stared at each other across the sterile laboratory. Crick's compound eyes registered surprise, confusion, and the first flickering traces of what would soon become absolute terror. Marcus Kane's single-pupilled eyes, however, showed only one thing: pure, calculating rage. "Impossible," Crick whispered, his molecular cutter trembling in his primary manipulator. "The sedation levels should have kept you unconscious for another 10 hours. Marcus Kane's response was not verbal. Instead, the human did something that violated every principle of mammalian biology that the Vorthak had ever documented. With his chest partially opened and his body secured by restraint cables designed to hold creatures 10 times his strength, Marcus Kane simply broke free. The sound of snapping restraint cables filled the laboratory like gunshots. Metal groaned, energy fields sparked, and the supposedly unbreakable bonds that had held thousands of specimens over the centuries simply gave way before human determination and adrenaline-fueled strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Security alert," Garn bellowed, his massive frame moving toward the examination table with surprising speed. "Specimen containment failure. Initiating emergency protocols." Marcus Kane rolled off the table, his partially dissected chest still weeping blood, and landed in a combat crouch that spoke of training the aliens had never seen before. His eyes swept the laboratory, cataloging threats, weapons, and escape routes in the space of a heartbeat. When he moved, it was with the fluid precision of a predator that had just realized he was in a target-rich environment. Zool, floating on his hover pad near the instrument array, became the first victim of human ingenuity. Marcus Kane's hand closed around a molecular cutter, and before the assistant could even process what was happening, the device was flying through the air with lethal accuracy. The energy blade sliced through Zool's hover pad control systems, sending the alien crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. "How did you," Crick began? But his question was cut short, as Marcus Kane vaulted over the fallen hover pad with athletic grace that their scans had suggested was impossible for human physiology. The molecular cutter that had been opening Marcus Kane's chest moments before was now in the human's hands, and he wielded it with the casual competence of someone who had spent years learning to kill with whatever was available. Zool's terrified screams filled the laboratory as the device that had been designed for precise surgical work found a much more violent application. "Zool!" Crick shouted, but his assistant was already beyond help. The young Vorthak's life signs flatlined on the monitoring equipment, painting the sterile walls with biological fluids that the cleaning systems would never quite manage to remove. Security Chief Garn reached for his weapon, a high-energy plasma disruptor that could drop a charging battlemorph in a single shot. But humans, it turned out, moved faster than Vorthak reflexes could track. Marcus Kane was across the laboratory in 3 strides, his bare feet silent on the polished floor, and the security chief found himself staring down the wrong end of his own weapon. "You dissected me while I was awake," Marcus Kane spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a tone that made the laboratory's temperature controls seem inadequate. "That was a mistake." The plasma disruptor discharged once, painting Garn's massive form across the laboratory's rear wall in patterns that would have been artistically interesting if they weren't so fundamentally horrifying. The security chief's dying gurgle was cut short as 200 kilograms of alien military muscle collapsed in a heap that smoked gently in the sterile air. Dr. Crick stood frozen beside his examination table, all 4 arms trembling as his superior intellect finally grasped the magnitude of his error. The human specimen that he had been casually dissecting was standing 3 meters away, covered in his own blood and that of 2 Vorthak researchers, holding a weapon that could vaporize organic matter at the molecular level. "You know," Marcus Kane said conversationally, wiping alien blood from his face with the back of his hand. "Your intelligence reports were wrong about human biology. We don't just have a single heart. We don't just have basic muscle density. And we sure as hell don't stay unconscious when you start cutting us open." Crick's mandibles clicked frantically as he backed toward the laboratory's emergency controls. "This is impossible. Our scans showed standard mammalian physiology. Single cardiovascular system, basic neural networks, no enhanced physical capabilities." Marcus Kane laughed, a sound that somehow made the sterile laboratory feel claustrophobic and threatening. Your scans showed what we wanted them to show. You think we go into alien space without preparation? You think we let ourselves get captured without contingency plans? The human moved closer, the plasma weapon steady in his hands despite the injuries that should have left him writhing in agony on the examination table. Blood continued to seep from the incisions in his chest, but he moved as if the wounds were minor inconveniences rather than potentially fatal injuries. Biological augmentation, Marcus Kane continued, enjoying the growing terror in the alien doctor's compound eyes. Enhanced healing, redundant cardiovascular systems, neural pathway modifications that let us stay conscious through procedures that would kill most species. We have been preparing for this war longer than you have been studying primitive mammals. Dr. Crick's superior intellect, the pride of Vorthak science, finally understood the scope of his miscalculation. The humans hadn't been captured randomly. They hadn't been transported to research facilities by accident. This had been planned, orchestrated, and executed with a precision that suggested intelligence capabilities far beyond what their assessments had indicated. "You let yourself be captured," Cricks whispered, the words tasting like defeat in his mouth. "I volunteered," Marcus Kane corrected, raising the plasma disruptor until it pointed directly at the doctor's primary neural cluster. Someone had to gather intelligence on Vorthak research capabilities. Someone had to map your facilities. Someone had to demonstrate exactly what happens when you try to dissect the human soldier. The laboratory's emergency lighting began flashing, casting alternating shadows across the carnage that had been a sterile research environment just minutes earlier. Alarm sirens wailed in frequencies that hurt alien ears, announcing that the Vorthak Medical Research Station was experiencing its first major security breach in 3 centuries. "Now," Marcus Kane said, his finger finding the weapon's trigger mechanism, "let's discuss the concept of informed consent." Dr. Cricks realized, in the final seconds of his distinguished career, that humanity had just taught the galaxy a very important lesson about the dangers of underestimating primitive species. The plasma disruptor's discharge turned Dr. Cricks into a brief, brilliant flash of superheated particles that painted abstract patterns across the laboratory ceiling. Marcus Kane studied the scorch marks with professional interest, noting how Vorthak biology responded to molecular disintegration, not much differently from any other organic matter as it turned out. Emergency klaxons continued wailing throughout the research station, their alien frequencies creating a discordant symphony that would have been annoying if Marcus hadn't been enjoying it so much. The facility's automated systems were finally recognizing that something had gone catastrophically wrong in Laboratory 7, though their response protocols had apparently never accounted for the possibility that a specimen might start hunting the researchers. Marcus Kane moved through the laboratory with methodical precision, collecting equipment that could serve his immediate needs. The Vorthak had thoughtfully provided an impressive array of medical instruments, each one designed for precise biological manipulation. The tissue separator became a close-quarters combat weapon. Neural probes transformed into lock-picking tools, and the molecular scanners, when properly reconfigured, made excellent improvised explosives. The laboratory's main door slid open as Marcus approached, the station's internal sensors registering his presence as authorized personnel. Apparently, the Vorthak security systems had never considered that their specimens might acquire weapons and start walking around freely. Another oversight that demonstrated the gap between alien intelligence and alien wisdom. The corridor beyond stretched in both directions, lined with additional laboratories, holding cells, and what appeared to be administrative offices. Soft blue lighting provided adequate visibility, while wall-mounted displays showed the facility's current status. According to the readouts, the Vorthak Medical Research Station housed 47 researchers, 23 security personnel, each in approximately 200 specimens from various worlds. Marcus Kane smiled, an expression that somehow made the sterile hallway feel predatory and threatening. 70 alien staff members who had spent their careers dissecting captured beings without consent, studying inferior species, and cataloging biological weaknesses for military applications. The tactical situation was what his instructors would have called a target-rich environment. Research Assistant Vex was the first to encounter the escaped specimen, emerging from Laboratory 12 with a data pad full of tissue analysis reports. The young Vorthak's compound eyes widened as they processed the sight of a partially dissected human walking calmly down the corridor, carrying advanced weapons and trailing blood that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than more vulnerable. "Security alert," Vex whispered into his communication device, backing slowly toward the nearest emergency station. "Specimen breach in Section 7. Human subject appears to be mobile and hostile." Marcus Kane tilted his head, studying the alien researcher with the same detached interest that Dr. Crix had shown earlier. "You know, your species talks about biological inferiority a lot for creatures that can't survive having their circulatory systems interrupted." The neural probe that had been examining Marcus Kane's brain tissue 20 minutes earlier found a new application as it penetrated Vex's primary neural cluster with surgical precision. The research assistant collapsed without understanding how a primitive bipedal mammal had moved fast enough to cross 15 meters of corridor before Vorthak reflexes could respond. Security technician Quall rounded the corner in time to witness his colleague's termination, his multiple arms reaching for the emergency weapons locker mounted on the hallway wall. But humans, it turned out, had spent millennia learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than they were. Evolution had given them persistence, adaptability, and a disturbing talent for violence that their enemies never quite expected. The molecular cutter that had opened Marcus Kane's chest cavity now opened Quall's thoracic region with equal efficiency, though considerably less scientific precision. The security technician's dying screams echoed through the research station's corridors, announcing to the remaining staff that their fundamental assumptions about human capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. Dr. This heard the commotion from her office in Section 9, where she had been reviewing preliminary reports on human psychology. The intelligence data suggested that humans were emotionally unstable, prone to panic under stress, and unlikely to maintain rational thought processes when subjected to pain or confinement. She was revising those assessments when her office door exploded inward. Marcus Kane stepped through the smoking remains of the security barrier, carrying a collection of improvised weapons that had been medical instruments 30 minutes earlier. His chest wounds continued bleeding, but he moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had discovered that being partially dissected was merely an inconvenience rather than a debilitating injury. "Dr. This is, I presume," Marcus Kane said, consulting a data pad he had acquired from one of his previous encounters, specialist in psychological warfare and behavioral modification. "You have written several papers on breaking the will of captured enemies." Dr. This activated her office's emergency protocols, sealing the additional entrances and summoning security assistance that was no longer available to respond. Her research had focused on the mental weaknesses of inferior species, not the physical capabilities of augmented soldiers who treated major surgery as a minor setback. "You can't sustain this level of activity with those injuries," she stated, trying to apply her psychological training to a situation that had moved well beyond theoretical parameters. "Your species requires immediate medical intervention to survive trauma of that magnitude." Marcus Kane glanced down at his partially open chest, where alien instruments had been mapping his internal structure less than an hour earlier. Blood continued seeping from the incisions, but the enhanced healing factors were already beginning to close the wounds. Redundant cardiovascular systems maintained circulation, while modified neural pathways managed pain responses that would have incapacitated baseline humans. "You keep talking about my species like you understand us," Marcus Kane replied, methodically checking the office's potential escape routes. "But your research was based on data from captured civilians, wasn't it? Merchants, colonists, non-combatants who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." Dr. This is backed toward her desk, where emergency communication equipment offered the possibility of summoning help from other sections of the research station. But her movement attracted Marcus Kane's attention, and humans had apparently learned to read body language with disturbing accuracy. "Military personnel received different training," Marcus Kane continued, advancing with predatory patience. "Enhanced biology, psychological conditioning, tactical education, and most importantly, advanced preparation for exactly this scenario. We knew the Vorthak were capturing our people. We knew about these research facilities. And we knew that someone would eventually volunteer to gather intelligence from the inside. The office's communication equipment sparked and died as a molecular scanner, reconfigured into an electromagnetic pulse generator, disabled the electronic systems with casual efficiency. Doctor. This has found herself trapped in a room with a creature that her species had classified as primitive, predictable, and easily controlled. The fascinating thing about human psychology, Marcus Kane said, selecting a tissue separator from his growing collection of improvised weapons, is that we become more dangerous when you hurt us, not less. Dr. This's final psychological assessment of human behavior was considerably more accurate than her previous research, though she lacked the opportunity to publish her revised conclusions. Commander Vex had been enjoying a routine morning review of research schedules when his communication array erupted in panicked reports from throughout the medical station. At first, the scattered transmissions seemed like equipment malfunctions or training exercises gone wrong. Specimen containment failures didn't happen on his facility, and certainly not from primitive bipedal mammals that could barely survive basic atmospheric variations. All security teams to combat readiness, Vex ordered, his 4 arms moving across the command console with practiced efficiency. Seal Laboratory Section 7 and initiate containment protocols for a single human subject. The tactical display showed Marcus Kane's position as a moving red dot that progressed through the facility with disturbing purpose. Security sensors tracked his movement from Laboratory 7 through the administrative corridors, past the specimen holding areas, and toward the facility's central computer core. Each location he passed showed declining life signs from the research staff, painting a trail of casualties that should have been impossible for a single injured mammal to create. "Sir," reported Security Lieutenant Dorks from his monitoring station, "the subject appears to be accessing our computer terminals. He's somehow interfacing with Vorthak technology without any apparent difficulty." Commander Vex studied the sensor readings with growing unease. Their security protocols assumed that escaped specimens would panic, hide, or attempt to flee the facility through obvious escape routes. None of their contingency plans had accounted for a subject that would methodically work its way toward the station's critical systems while eliminating personnel with surgical precision. "Deploy Security Team Alpha to intercept," Vex commanded. "Standard suppression protocols. Non-lethal containment preferred, but authorized deadly force if necessary." Security Team Alpha consisted of 6 heavily armed Vorthak soldiers, each equipped with plasma weapons, energy shields, and enough combat experience to handle dangerous specimens from across the galaxy. They moved through the facility's corridors with professional confidence, their sensors tracking the human's location as he accessed another computer terminal in Section 5. Team leader Grex had subdued everything from rampaging crystalloid warriors to telepathic Nexus assassins during his career. One partially dissected human should have been a routine containment exercise, especially considering the subject's obvious injuries and lack of proper equipment. The tactical scanners showed a single organic target with damaged cardiovascular systems and no detectable armor or advanced weaponry. Target acquired, Grex reported as his team positioned themselves around the computer terminal where Marcus Kane was working. Human subject appears focused on data extraction, moving to surround and contain. What happened next violated every principle of tactical engagement that Security Team Alpha had learned during their military training. Marcus Kane didn't panic when 6 armed soldiers surrounded him. He didn't attempt to flee or surrender when confronted with overwhelming firepower. Instead, he smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as expected. The computer terminal that Marcus Kane had been accessing suddenly overloaded, sending cascades of electrical energy through the facility's power grid. The corridor lights flickered and died, emergency systems activated throughout the station, and Security Team Alpha found themselves operating in near total darkness while their target had apparently vanished. "Thermal imaging," Grex ordered, switching his weapons targeting system to heat-sensitive mode. "Locate the subject and maintain formation." But humans, it turned out, had learned to control their thermal signatures during combat operations. Advanced training allowed them to minimize heat emission, move silently through hostile environments, and strike from unexpected angles while their enemies were still trying to locate them with conventional sensors. Grex's thermal scanner detected the attack approximately 0.3 seconds before a molecular cutter, reconfigured as a close-quarters weapon, penetrated his combat armor at its weakest connection point. His dying scream warned the rest of Security Team Alpha that their fundamental assumptions about human combat capabilities had been catastrophically incorrect. Private Yoss attempted to provide covering fire for his fallen team leader, but discovered that humans possessed a disturbing understanding of alien psychology. The corridor's darkness had been transformed into a tactical advantage, with Marcus Kane using the facility's own architecture to create ambush points and kill zones that maximized alien confusion while minimizing his own exposure. He's using the ventilation systems, Yoas reported into his communication device, just before a neural probe, fired from an improvised projectile weapon, terminated his analysis of human tactical adaptability. The remaining 4 members of Security Team Alpha found themselves engaged in a running battle with an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Marcus Kane had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of the facility's layout, security protocols, and weapon capabilities, despite being unconscious during his initial transport to the station. Sergeant Cool attempted to flush the human from his concealed position using area effect plasma charges, but discovered that humans had spent millennia learning to survive in hostile environments. The molecular scanners that Marcus Kane had been reconfiguring weren't just improvised weapons, they were sophisticated electronic warfare tools that could disrupt Vorthak targeting systems and communications equipment. Command, this is Security Team Alpha. Cool transmitted through increasing static interference. Recommend facility-wide lockdown and deployment of all available units. Human subject demonstrates combat capabilities far exceeding initial assessments. Commander Vex received the transmission just as his tactical display showed 3 more members of Security Team Alpha transitioning from active to casualty status. The human's position marker continued moving through the facility with methodical purpose, now accessing the central computer core that contained the station's operational databases and research archives. All units to combat stations, Vex announced facility-wide. Initiate total lockdown protocols. Seal all sections and prepare for coordinated assault on the computer core. But Marcus Kane had apparently anticipated the facility's response procedures with disturbing accuracy. The computer terminals he had been accessing weren't just sources of tactical intelligence, they were access points for the station's environmental systems, security networks, and communication arrays. With each terminal he compromised, more of the facility's critical systems came under his control. The atmospheric processors began cycling through emergency sequences that filled certain corridors with toxic gases while evacuating oxygen from others. Security barriers activated in patterns that isolated Vorthak personnel while creating clear paths for human movement. The communication frequencies became jammed with feedback loops that prevented coordination between the remaining security teams. Private Zan from Security Team Beta experienced the horror of fighting an opponent who had turned the facility itself into a weapon. Corridor lights activated and deactivated in sequences that created strobing effects designed to disrupt Vorthak visual processing. Temperature controls fluctuated between extremes that affected alien equipment performance while apparently having minimal impact on human physiology. He's not just surviving in our environment, Zan reported to anyone still listening on the communication channels. He's adapting it to hunt us. The molecular cutter that ended Zan's tactical analysis had been fired from a maintenance access point that shouldn't have been large enough for human entry. But the preliminary scans of human flexibility and joint mobility had apparently been as inaccurate as every other aspect of their biological assessment. Commander Vex watched his security forces being systematically eliminated by a single specimen that had been classified as primitive, predictable, and easily contained. The human's tactical thinking demonstrated strategic capabilities that suggested intelligence training far beyond what their psychological profiles had indicated. Evacuation protocols, Vex finally admitted, his pride as facility commander warring with his responsibility for the remaining personnel, all non-essential staff to emergency escape pods, prepare to abandon the research station. But as he activated the evacuation systems, Commander Vex realized that Marcus Kane had been herding them toward this decision from the beginning. The human hadn't been randomly destroying equipment and personnel. He had been systematically eliminating the station's capability to continue its research operations while gathering intelligence on Vorthak military procedures. The escaped specimen had been conducting a military operation with precision that would have impressed Vorthak tactical instructors, if any of them had survived long enough to analyze his techniques. Commander Vex found Marcus Kane in the facility's central command center, standing amid the ruins of what had been the galaxy's most advanced biological research station. The human was methodically downloading data from the primary computers, his wounds now almost completely healed thanks to biological augmentations that made a mockery of every Vorthak assessment of mammalian physiology. Impressive facility you had here, Marcus Kane commented without looking up from the data transfer. Past tense being the operative phrase, of course. Your research archives contain some fascinating information about other species you have been dissecting without their consent. The command center's holographic displays showed the station's current status in colors that would have been beautiful if they weren't so uniformly catastrophic. Red indicators marked system failures throughout the facility. Orange warnings highlighted sections that were no longer habitable. Yellow cautions noted areas where the atmospheric processors had been reconfigured to create environmental hazards that made passage impossible for Vorthak physiology. You were never a specimen, Commander Vex realized, his forearms trembling as he processed the scope of his facility's destruction. This entire operation was planned from the beginning. Marcus Kane finally turned to face the facility commander, and Vex found himself staring into eyes that held intelligence, calculation, and a disturbing amount of satisfaction. The human's partially healed chest wounds were visible beneath the improvised medical garments he had fashioned from alien materials, serving as a reminder that he had accomplished all of this while recovering from major surgery. Military intelligence suggested that the Vorthak were conducting illegal biological experiments on captured humans, Marcus Kane explained, disconnecting the data storage device from the central computer. Command needed detailed information about your capabilities, your research methods, and your facility locations. Someone had to volunteer for deep insertion reconnaissance. The evacuation alarms continued wailing throughout the station, though most of the personnel who might have responded to them were no longer capable of evacuation or anything else. The few survivors had already departed in emergency escape pods, carrying with them stories that would fundamentally alter how the galaxy viewed human military capabilities. Your species will pay for this atrocity, Vex declared, reaching for the emergency weapon mounted beside his command chair. The hegemony will not tolerate such barbaric behavior from primitive mammals. Marcus Kane's laugh was perhaps the most terrifying sound that had ever echoed through the Vorthak Medical Research Station's corridors. It carried genuine amusement, dark satisfaction, and the promise of consequences that extended far beyond this single facility. Commander, you spent decades dissecting sentient beings while they were still alive, conducting experiments without consent, and studying how to more efficiently exterminate entire species. Marcus Kane replied, casually disarming the alien officer with movements too fast for Vorthak reflexes to track. And you are calling us barbaric? The facility's main communication array activated under Marcus Kane's control, broadcasting on frequencies that would reach every hegemony installation within 50 light years. His message was simple, direct, and calculated to cause maximum psychological impact on species that had built their expansion on assumptions of human inferiority. This is Marcus Kane, Human Recon Specialist, transmitting from the former Vorthak Medical Research Station, he announced to the galaxy at large. Your facility has been neutralized. Your research data has been acquired. Your personnel have discovered that humans are significantly more resilient than your intelligence assessments suggested. Commander Vex listened to the transmission with growing horror, realizing that the consequences of this single human's actions would extend far beyond the destruction of his research station. Every military installation, every government facility, Every research center in hegemony space would receive this message and understand that humanity possessed capabilities they had never suspected. Consider this a professional courtesy, Marcus Kane continued his broadcast. The next time you capture human personnel, remember that we have redundant biological systems, enhanced healing capabilities, and psychological conditioning that allows us to remain conscious during procedures that would kill most species, and contingency plans that account for scenarios you have never imagined. The human began walking toward the command center's emergency escape pod bay, pausing only to collect additional data storage devices and weapon systems that might prove useful during his extraction. His movements remained fluid and confident despite the injuries that should have been fatal, yet demonstrating physical capabilities that rendered every Vorthak biological assessment obsolete. "You cannot possibly escape from this sector," Vex protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "The hegemony patrol fleets will intercept any human vessel attempting to leave the system." Marcus Kane smiled as he reached the escape pod controls, entering commands with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time studying alien technology. "Commander, you still don't understand what you are dealing with. This wasn't a solo operation. Human military doctrine includes extraction protocols that account for deep reconnaissance missions in hostile territory. The escape pod launched just as the first human fleet vessels dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge, and their approach vectors calculated to provide maximum tactical advantage while demonstrating capabilities that made hegemony intelligence assessments look like children's fairy tales. Heroes! As Commander Vex watched the pod disappear into the darkness between stars, he realized that the Vorthak Medical Research Station had just provided the galaxy with a very expensive education. They had learned that humans were not primitive mammals. They were apex predators who had disguised themselves as prey until the moment came to strike. The final irony wasn't lost on him as he prepared his own evacuation from the ruined facility. For 3 centuries, the Vorthak had studied inferior species, catalogued their weaknesses, and dismissed their potential for resistance. They had built their reputation on the assumption that intelligence and technology could overcome any biological limitation. But they had never considered the possibility that the primitive species they were studying might be more intelligent than they were, better prepared for conflict, and perfectly willing to sacrifice individual soldiers to gather intelligence on their enemies' capabilities. Commander Vex's final report to Hegemony Command would recommend an immediate revision of human threat assessments. The primitive bipedal mammals had just demonstrated that in the game of evolutionary survival, they were several moves ahead of species that thought themselves superior. The hunters had become the hunted, and the galaxy would never make the mistake of underestimating humanity again.